I also want to remind you, and this is not a particularly well-known fact, that on the equinox on March the 20th, which is around the corner, it is World Rewilding Day. So if you have any influence on staging any kinds of events, however small or however insignificant, this is a lovely moment for you to gather the troops together and to remember the environment. I also want to call out an organization called Rewilding the Global Alliance, with whom we hold hands. This is an international consortium of scientists and rewilding practitioners and just people who are concerned about the environment globally. They're all over the world. They've recently drawn up a very interesting charter on what they hope to see as a set of goals for rewilding throughout the world. And for anybody who's more interested in the work they do and in the charter that's been formulated, I would recommend that you go to info@rewildingglobal.org, which is the website where you will find their work. I'm now going to hand over without any more ado to Paul. Thank you, Paul, for being part of this, and over to you now.
Okay. I will now try and share my screen with you, and just let me do that, and we will go to view full screen. Slideshow. Okay. Just for you, I'll introduce myself a little bit. My name is Paul. My name is Paul Blanchflower. I originally came from England to India 30 years ago when I was 24. I had studied ecology and forestry in Edinburgh University. And there I had met a young lady who was also on the same course, and she had grown up in the international community of Oroville. So when I finished university, I had a big interest to work with native species, but also in the tropics. And so I came to Oroville thinking that I could stay here for a couple of years and maybe move on and do other projects around the world. But Oroville has been a great home to me, and I have met a large number of very interesting people who have done amazing work with connection to the environment. And so I've ended up staying here and becoming a part of the community here. So that's a little bit about where I came from. I am now the, I am struggling. We started the Oroville Botanical Gardens 20 years ago. It was a barren piece of land that was connected to the Oroville community. And I have spent the last 20 years building the garden with a great team of other people who have come along over the years. And we've started to create what is now a very beautiful space. The idea behind the Oroville Botanical Gardens was really to create a place that could showcase the work that has gone on in Oroville over the last 50 years. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that's where I work. I work there most days. Otherwise, I'll be traveling on other projects that we do outside. There's three aspects to the botanical gardens. One is the development of the gardens themselves. We started 20 years ago with very little budget, just some vague ideas that we would create a botanical gardens. And since then, over the years, we've slowly gathered the funding and the energy to create the garden. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're still developing the gardens. We have new gardens that we're working on at the moment. The second thing we do is environmental education, which I will talk about towards the end of the talk. But it's very much that place where we can reconnect people to nature. And so we run school programs with the local schools, and we also run training courses. This year we've been running our ecological horticulture course, which has run this year for 4 months, where we have a number of young people from various backgrounds who spend 4 months with us, listening to lectures, working practically in the garden to understand the ecology of the area and how to create gardens in a very ecological manner. And the third aspect of what we do at the Botanical Gardens is we run projects outside with the aim of restoring nature, of using the native plants of the area to create any kind of garden, campus, or as we move on in time, we've started to work on very large projects where we start to try and use the native plants in the restoration of industrial areas. So these are the three things that we're doing at the gardens. One is education, one is developing the gardens, and the third one is running the projects outside. The story really starts in the Oroville context. For those of you who have not heard of Oroville or don't know too much about Oroville, Oroville began in 1968. And this was a picture taken on the inauguration when many people came from Pondicherry, the ashram. It was started by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who were philosophers and teachers. They ran the ashram in Pondicherry, and their idea was simply to create an international township where people could come from all over the world and to try and work out how to live together and find human unity. So it started in 1968, and it started on a plateau that was extremely barren. This is how it looked in the beginning. There was really no trees in sight. It was a sandy plateau. It's quite a small plateau. It's probably 10 kilometers by 5 kilometers wide. It rises up to about 60 meters, and it's quite close to the sea. The soil is very sandy. And so what had happened here was that there was dryland agriculture going on, which meant that a lot of the land was heavily eroded during the monsoon rains, which were coming in, the northeast monsoon, which was between October and December. So a lot of the lands were quite bad. There was a very high level of poverty in the area. And so people actually were quite willing to sell large parcels of land. And that's how Oroville came to exist in this particular area. There were no villages around. And so the story began with people in the 60s, idealistic young people, people connected to the spiritual works of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Generally, there were lots of people, idealistic young people traveling the world, and they all came and settled in Oroville and began a process of creating an environment where people could live. And so the first thing that a lot of people did was plant trees, which meant that the landscape transformed. So from the early 70s, you can see these dramatic pictures which were taken in the same places, the dramatic changes, which happens when we plant trees. Trees are amazing restorers of the environment. And I arrived about 1990. So when I arrived, a lot of the work in terms of planting the lands with the first pioneer species had been done. But there was a large forest that was there, but not so diverse, because people had just taken it on. There weren't experts. There were people that had knowledge, people that had interest. But at the time I arrived, there was a lot of interest in what is actually the native plants of this area. There was a small group. I say a lot, but actually it was a small group of people, and I joined in with them with my youthful enthusiasm. And so we started to look at that aspect of the forests. And this is how Oroville looks today. It's a diverse ecosystem. The picture in the middle is Machmandir, which is the central hub of Oroville. And it is quite beautifully surrounded by forests. The forest area covers about 3,000 acres, and there's another 2,000 of acres where buildings have come, but still the tree cover is intact. So it's actually a really beautiful green oasis within the area. And many people come here today and can't believe that 50 years ago it was a barren wasteland with large canyons and highly eroded plateaus. So this is the culture that I arrived into and learned from. And it was an amazing group of pioneering individuals who'd started this process. And so the Oroville work is really, when you look at the Oroville forest, it's really a collective work. It handed over from one person to the next person. Some people have been here 50 years, some people have come and gone. And so it's really a collective work with collective knowledge, which has transformed this plateau and continues today with many people working in the forest areas and other people like myself who take our knowledge that's been collectively gained, and take it outside and try and create projects in other places. Um, so one of the questions that I asked when I first arrived and worked with other people is, what was the ecologically appropriate vegetation of this area? And we found, to our delight, that there was this beautiful forest called the tropical dry evergreen forest, which we call the TDEF, as it's much easier to say. This has around 400 woody or bulbous species. So when I say bulbous, I mean orchids or crinums or vines like the Gloriosa superba that you can see here in the picture. But the amazing thing about the tropical dry evergreen forest is that there's these wonderful evergreen species that stay full evergreen the whole year. And they produce amazing flowers. Like this is a Memsilon, which creates these beautiful blue flowers once or twice a year, depending on the rains, with fantastic fragrance. So this was something that interested me, was how to restore this forest. We found it in sacred groves, 1 acre, half an acre, where we found these evergreen species still in their complex. The reserve forests, which were looked after by the forest department, had been managed as woodlots during the colonial times, and so they were very degraded, very thorny, and so the whole population there was skewed. But in these little temple groves, we really found an extraordinary complex of evergreen species, of which we found that 150 actually had landscaping potential. But that was another part of the story, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So we found this range of evergreen species, and we started to underplant the Oroville forests with those. And that became the work that I started for the first 10 years of my existence here. I learned the species, I explored the area, I went out, we collected seeds. And of course, once you've collected seeds, you want to germinate seeds. So the next thing I did was germinate seeds. And then I had seeds that had germinated into seedlings. And so we started planting those in the forests. And we ran projects. And the great thing about the Oroville forests were that we could underplant the other species that had been planted because these evergreens were tolerant to the shade. And so in that way, the Oroville forests moved from being a primary pioneer forest, which had a mix of species from all over India and even from outside of India. And it's now becoming this very strong native forest that is totally adapted to the area, and which has these amazingly resilient features to it. For example, we had the cyclone in 2011 and 12, and many of the exotic trees blew over because their root systems were shallow and they were not adapted to cyclonic conditions. Whereas the species of the tropical dry evergreen forest are completely resilient to cyclones because they don't grow tall and they have buttressed roots, and they send their roots nicely into the soil. So there's a great world there of native plants, which was there for us to explore and expand upon. And so there was this moment when, in my philosophical times, I felt that on the planet, there seems to be so much pressure from humanity that unless there's a relationship between any entity and human beings, that other entity can be pushed aside. It can be a beneficial relationship, as you would probably have read with Michael Pollan in his books, The Botany of Desire. He tells us how plants can attract us and draw us in and make us work for them. It can be a parasitical. I mean, viruses and germs, they have a relationship with us and thrive quite well because there's lots of us around. But unless there is that relationship, then things will be slowly pushed to the side. And I think for me, that moment of realization came that if we can speak for the forest, if we can become the advocate for the forest and show society how the forest has a relevance to today's society, whether it be in landscaping, be it in creating forests, be it in restoration ecology, I think people can understand that there is a relationship between themselves and that forest, and hopefully we can then cement that relationship and develop a more sustainable and equitable ecology that we can thrive within. And so we always say that our job is to explain to society at large how they can benefit from the tropical dry evergreen forest. And so we've worked with different organizations and different people to use the TDF to create these vibrant and dynamic landscapes. be it the factories of TVS or the hotels of the Hyatt. We've created landscapes and gardens for them using these beautiful, amazing plants. In that situation, we're not literally restoring ecology, but what we are is creating shelter belts, little groves where all of these species can happily coexist, and they will have these flowering and fruiting events throughout the year, which definitely means that the butterflies, the birds, the insects are all finding food and foraging abilities, and a great habitat. We can take just 3 meters wide and create a beautiful shelter belt with a diversity of 60, 70 species. And that becomes a thriving, amazing little habitat for the biodiversity, which can easily wrap around a factory or any kind of campus without taking up too much land. So this was one of the strong elements of what I could see, and how we've sort of created the botanical gardens on the back of this, getting people to use the tropical dry evergreen forest as a part of society, as a way of creating a landscapes. And just to mention that when we encourage people to work with the native plants, be it a factory that, again, using the example of TVS, if they have their factories in the rural areas where they often do in areas of high unemployment, by creating these natural forests, we're also offering services to the agricultural systems that are around, because we're providing these habitats for the pollinators. You may well have heard that already, that coffee estates that are found closer to native forests, within 5 kilometers of native forests, are highly productive compared to those that are far away or mixed in with the silver oak plantations. So pollinators are a really powerful ecosystem service that the native plants provide this palette of resources throughout the year. The question always is when the mango trees stop flowering, where do the bees go? If they can return to the native forest, their populations can stay high and sustainable. And that's there. So all of these flowers are part of the tropical dry evergreen forest. We have memsilons, we have the ebony flower here from Diospyros ebanum. This is an ochna. We have a wonderful plant called Dimorpha calyx, which I'm not sure many people would know about, but it has beautiful feature of bark on the stem. Erythria pubescens, which has wonderful berries that the birds really enjoy. And of course, we have a wild jasmine, Jasmine cuspidatum, which flowers pretty much continuously throughout the year. Mariah, which a lot of people already use in landscapes. Ixoras, Glycosmis, Maniocaras, Eugenias. So we have a wide range of very interesting flowering events, which really help the bees and people to enjoy the landscape. Native plants can also be used in creating hedges. All of these are examples of native plants. This one's Carmona, jasmine, the surigata, to create forms. And this is a maze that we planted at the Botanical Garden, which has over 20 species of evergreen shrubs embedded in it. And none of these require the watering. They're all drought tolerant throughout the summer. They maintain their evergreen leaves. So we could see that there was this extraordinary potential within the native forests to work with society. And we could also see that the growth rate of the TDF is comparable with other plants if you water them. And the great advantage is that as they establish, they don't need the aftercare. They live and they're adapted to these local climatic conditions. So this has always formed the basis of our work. And we've managed to commercialize the work with these species so that it supports the work at the Botanical Gardens, and hopefully adds beauty and dynamic landscapes to the world around us. Over the years, we've started to take on larger projects. And this is a project that we did with Ashok Leyland. You can see the project site here. It began as a wetland, a completely monotonous, level marshland. This is quite close to the coast. It's in northern Chennai, in a heavily industrialized area. It's a site that we took on. We created a design, and here we were working with wetland species that we knew would tolerate the slightly saline conditions. again, using that ecological knowledge. These are quite a lot of native plants that we knew would survive, because the groundwater here is around 2,200 as a TDS. So we were using plants like Salvadora persica, Thespesia. We found that the banyan tree, the different types of ficus, Ficus amplissima, Ficus microcarpa, were also doing very well, and shrubs like Premna ceratifolia and Clerodendron. So we created a wetland with Ashok Leyland, and this was one of our first. We had done a number of projects before this, but this was one of our first large excavation projects. And you can see here that we started pretty much with a flat land, where we dug the canals and we created water channels. We managed to take all this. There's a 150-acre campus, and we were working on 26 acres. So we managed to take all the road water, and so our ponds and canals fill up very quickly. The black cotton soil doesn't allow any percolation, so we pretty much maintain the water throughout the year without any lining. And the grasses have now grown nicely, so that the canal sides, which were bare in the beginning, here you can see them after one monsoon, and here you see that the whole area developed within 2 years. Obviously today that area is now even denser and thicker, but this was one of the large projects that we started to do, and we started to see that we could really begin on this sort of a scale to create a local ecology. Many water birds came to this area, and we found that again the birds and the butterflies really came back. This was another project that we then started working with Vasant, who gave a talk a week ago, I think, in Uti. So we were approached by a developer, and we took our ideas and worked with Vasant, because he had the understanding of the local ecology. And so to bring back that idea, we had one valley there where we could plant the shola trees. So we really started to try and recreate that ecology of the shola within the tea plantations. And he also had this very strong connection to the local grasses and to the local herbs. And so that formed and became part of that ecological landscape in Uti. As we developed our skills, we realized that a lot of working with the land, a lot of working with the ecology of the area was about understanding the land. And we found that working with a handheld GPS and Google Earth they're quite simple, sort of anybody can do it. You don't need large budgets or lots of technology to do it. But by walking the land, by becoming involved in the land and spending days just walking and using the GPS and locating different areas and understanding the different niches and ecologies, it gave us a lot of strength when we were working with larger projects on the hill lands. This is a project we took on in Hyderabad. And we learned that you can do very, very simple with Google Earth. You can create these profiles. You can create 3D relief models. The whole thing is very, very easy to put together. And I think it's an amazing tool that a lot of people should start to use, or probably do. I'm not sure, but this is something that we found was a very powerful technique. And it also drew us into the landscape. With the idea that it becomes very easy to name the landscape. And as soon as you start naming the landscape, as you see in this bottom picture, you start to get people to relate to the landscape. They know where they are. They know how they're in the landscape, where they're in the landscape, and it gives them references. So again, when they're walking into that landscape and you give them those tags, as it were, they start to feel familiar with the landscape. The landscape becomes part of them. And so this is something that we try to do a lot, is naming the landscape. And at the same time, we also point out those extraordinary trees that are still on the site, particularly in these degraded areas. And it helps people to form that relationship, which is pretty much the idea that's at the core of our work, creating that relationship between the people and the landscape. And that brings me to where we are today. So really what I've done is give you a very brief introduction to the work that we are doing. And in the last 3 years or 4 years, we've been working quite a lot with Ramco Cements. They approached us through some connections in Oroville, and we've now started working with them for the restoration of their mine areas. So these are old industrial mines that were pretty much abandoned and neglected. And we have started a program of restoring the quarries and also other sites with them. So at this point, I would like to just share a video. This video was made in June last year. So it's not totally up to date. Things have changed, obviously, but at least it gives you a good idea of what we're doing and how we're working with Ramco Cement. So I'll just change the screen and put the movie on. It's an 8-minute video, and hopefully it works nicely. B.S. Pradeep has given me the clues of how to do it. We are looking at the ecological restoration zone of Ramco Cements. The project began 18 months ago and is located in Pandalguri, South India, which has a low annual rainfall of around 600 millimeters per year. The aim is to create a recreational forest that promotes native species of flora and fauna. Before the work started, the area was a landscape of rock and rubble, dominated by a single thorny species, Prosopis juliflora, which provides scant resources for other species. The first impression was a tired landscape, one that had been worked out and left behind. But there was one unique feature which provided the inspiration for the project's conception. The natural ponds, left in the depths of the quarries, previously a hindrance to the mining operations, and now an extraordinary asset for the ecology of the area. And it is not only the water, but also the diverse ecological niches to be found in the quarry walls. The other clues found in the area were the ancient trees, tucked away in forgotten corners. These are the species adapted to the tough summer conditions characteristic to the area. However, in order to plant them, their seeds need to be collected, and they must be grown specifically for the project, as they are not to be found in commercial nurseries. Another amazing resource are the rocks, left over from the quarrying work. Each has its own unique character and story to tell. And on top of all of this, life itself had found a way to inhabit the land. Sightings of birds in the area gave hope that this was not the uninhabited desert first thought. And as soon as the upper pond was filled, we were graced by the visit of a wagtail, a bird that is happiest in the shallow waters of the pond margin. So the vision is there, to create an environment that provides for the recreation of the local residents, for the environmental education of the surrounding schools, for the day visits of people from nearby towns, as well as promoting the biodiversity of the local species of animals and plants native to the area. This project is a Ramco initiative, and from the company side there is support at every level, which means that the work can progress smoothly from design to implementation, and that there is a real desire and interest to see rapid and sustainable results. And so we have moved from the design stage into the various steps of implementation.
This first phase of the project covers over 200 acres. Work began in December 2018 with the grading of the dump heaps. This was followed by the shaping of the land, placing of rocks and creation of landscape features such as paths and steps and ponds. Then, towards the middle of the year, the tree plantation program began, with the aim of creating a natural forest across the entire site, around 60 acres of plantation. This required over 60,000 trees and shrubs, as well as a large number of drought-resistant agavs and other shrubs which are required to stabilize the loose soil. Utilizing water from the pit and ensuring a good soil mix for the plants, the growth rate was extremely encouraging. Additionally, in strategic locations around the site, viewpoints have been created so that visitors will be encouraged to explore the area. And at each point, interpretation material will be there, with information and explanations to enhance the visitor's experience and understanding of the area. Topics covered include the working life of the quarry, the animals we can see in the park, and the geological history of the area. As the months pass, the ideas come off the paper and emerge into the physical landscape. These raised beds, created with the rocks found on site, are part of the xerophytic garden, and they highlight plants adapted to dry conditions. It is an integral part of the Interpretation Centre, which has come through the design phase from concept to detailed drawing and is now in the process of construction. The entrance to the site has also been completed, along with the parking area. From here, visitors will walk beneath the canopy of ficus trees growing out of the rocks before they enter into the rest of the site. Already the project has received groups interested in the work that is unfolding. For example, these students of forestry and ecology visited in January 2020. We are 18 months into the project. Much has been achieved, and there is more to do. This year, we will plant over 150,000 native saplings to cover the 150 acres of Pit 1. And the potential for the project does not stop here. There are 800 acres of land that over the next 5 years can be restored to a natural forest that will be able to support a whole new set of animals, providing a meaningful experience for all the visitors. We have begun a process that hopefully will spark interest across the mining industry as they see the potential and value of restoring the lands that they have profited from for future generations to enjoy.
So that, whoops, I didn't stop the video. So that project has now been running for another, since we took that last video, it's been running for another year. What you were seeing there was the central 65 acres. The majority of the shots there were of the central 65 acres, where we've created gardens along with forest. The species we've used has been a mix of native species and also local Indian species such as neems or banyans or Ficus religiosa, the people tree. So what we're trying to do there is create an interface that visitors can come to, the local residents, the local schools, to create we've created an environment center with a similar model to the way we work at the Botanical Gardens. But since then, this last year, we've taken on that extra 150 acres, and there we're planting this year 150,000 trees. And the process there has been extraordinarily interesting as we've worked with Ramco, because we've taken horticultural students and embedded them in our course and then sent them back out to the Ramco teams. So we're actually training horticulturalists from the Ramco organization, teaching them about the native species and putting them back out into the different sites. Last year there were 2, and this year we have 5 students from the Ramco teams. And what we're now doing is creating the nurseries. And that is perhaps the key to all of these projects, in the sense that without the native species, these species that nobody really pays too much attention to in the commercial nurseries, because they're not the easy forestry trees that you can find with the forest department. Those seeds are easy to collect, the trees respond. So you have a palette of maybe 15, 20 species that are with the forest department. But when we really get into the local species that are adapted to these local areas, they're not grown. We grow them in the nursery in Oroville, and this year we grew 80,000 trees for our projects, but that's not enough because the scale of the work is getting larger and larger. And so what we need to do is create these nurseries within the organizations that we're working with, and to get them to grow the local native species. This is the key to the multiplier of this kind of approach. For example, in this area, we get 600 mm of rainfall, and we're finding interesting species. For example, there's a balanitis, which you saw in one of the photos, Balanitis roxburghi, which generally grows in Rajasthan or in the dry areas of the northwest of India. But it reoccurs down here because this is the rain shadow that's sandwiched between the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. So the rainfall pattern here is very minimal. We also find Salvadora persica, which is found again as you go all the way towards through to Persia. And there's another species that we showed there, which was Albizia lathami. So we all know the Albizia labex, as it's a magnificent tree. But the Albizia lathami we found there, we've only found 4 individuals now. And it's quite a rare tree, but we managed this year to get 1,000 seeds and grow 1,000 seedlings. So there is the potential to reforest these sites with the native species, which has the same ethos and ethic that I was talking about with the tropical dry evergreen forest. These are the plants that are adapted to these local conditions that can survive through the hot, dry summers without too much maintenance once we've established them. And I think that's one of the key points as well, is to understand that native species, when we're rewilding, when we're recreating forests and we're working with native species, we still need to look after those species. It's not that they're native and therefore they can survive with no maintenance and no aftercare. They will do if it's a good year. But if it's a bad year, if it's a hot, dry summer, then we won't get the survival that we really deserve, having put all that energy into creating those seedlings in the nursery. In nature, we have this situation where the recruitment to the forest is only once in every 7 or 10 years. We need good seed source from the previous year. And then we need a good year where the rains come regularly and early in the summer and help the seeds to germinate and then survive through to the monsoon. And again, even in the second year, if we have good rains, then we have a lovely recruitment to the forest. When we're working on projects ourselves, when we're rewilding or reforesting areas, aftercare gives the plants that guarantee of 1 or 2 or 3 good years. The first year in the nursery is fantastic. They get watered every other day. And then when they're planted out, we need to water them once a week or once every 2 weeks to get them established and let their roots go down. And then once they're established, then we can move on with the native species and let them do their own thing and create what is actually a forest that then finds its own way. Our job is really in the beginning to put those species in and then let them form their own matrix as time goes by and they sort themselves out and start reseeding and regrowing themselves from their own regeneration, which is the process that's begun and is quite strong now in Oroville, as we find a lot of trees are regenerating in large areas. So this was one project that it's now almost finished. We're making a new video this year, which will be out, which will show this project another year on. and the growth rates and the success is wonderful. And the company is happy now to move on to the next 100 acres and the next 100 acres. So within the next 3 or 4 years, we should have covered that 800 acres as the mines to the west become worked out. And we will create a fantastic ecological area where many of the animals, the owls, we have at least 3 breeding pairs, if not 4 breeding pairs of the great Indian horned owl that are surviving in the forests. I just then was wanting to show you another project that we're starting now with Ramcor, because it's another old industrial site, and it just gives another perspective on the work that is possible once you've begun the idea. And this is a crusher plant that is in Isola, which is also in Tamil Nadu. And it's an old, what you're looking at here are the pictures of the hoppers where they used to store the crushed limestone. And this was the site as we saw it 6 months ago, with the conveyor belts, where you can see the conveyor belts would take the crushed limestone into these large hoppers. And they have actually finished using this site. All the metal structures are now being dismantled, and they've given us the chance to create an eco park in this area. And so this is what we're proposing, is to take these are about 30 meters high, these structures. So this would be about 40 meters long and 30 meters high, and they're super strong. These pillars were designed to hold thousands of tons of limestone. And so we can take on these old industrial areas and we can plant forests, green roofs, native species and forests all around to create this eco park, which again can show this change, this change from our industrial society back to a green world. And I think it's a very powerful chance to create a park that's stunning and that gives us this way to communicate with people, which is really, again, to reiterate, is at the core of everything we're trying to do. We're trying to communicate with people about the beauty of nature, the power of nature, and connect people back to the native plants, whether it's in a wild situation or in this situation where we will be in a more of a park environment. These are the existing structures that we were offered and given. And so we've designed a project here where we try and take these and create within that area the master plan for the landscape. These were where the buildings are. You can't see them so well because we've camouflaged them with the green roofs. But it will be a park again with a similar construct to the botanical gardens in Oroville or to the project we've done in Pandalgudi at the mine restoration, where we have students coming every day for ecological classes. But this one, we can also attract some tourism from Trichy, from Tanjavur, and have day visitors coming to visit the site and to learn a little bit about ecology. Here we have a wonderful opportunity to also talk about fossils, because the limestone mines of this area are an old sea. So we have amazing fossils that have been left behind. And also to get people engaged in adventure and activities, outdoor activities, so that people connect nature and outdoor pursuits in the same thought. This is the concept. These are some of just the artistic renditions that we've created to show how we will change the area. We'll create a lake. We're on black cotton soil, so the black cotton soil will keep the zero percolation. So we'll just keep the water topped up from the mining areas, and then just to create sort of art and sort of interest, so that people can explore the different buildings. But all of this plantation we will do with the native species. Native species of ficus will be predominant, but also the tropical dry evergreen forest will feature very heavily in the plantations here, so that we're recreating a forest a bit like Angkor Wat. That's what we call it, the industrial Angkor Wat from Cambodia, here in South India. We'll create a fossil garden with the fossils that we find around and the limestone, so that we also create that interest in the geological history of the planet, which is another wonderful world to explore and get involved with. It's lovely to learn about the natural world, but also to learn about the processes, even the dinosaurs, the history of the planet is quite wonderful. Another world that we can get involved in, and to take sort of like existing structures that that are there and turn them into, this is the old cable gantry where the cables for the whole site ran, and we can easily turn that into a treetop walk where we're walking across the canopy and seeing the site from above. And we can see agaves, cactuses from above. We can also see the trees, and we'll create sort of canopy gardens. And eventually with the buildings, we hope to, this is a cross section, but we will, the idea is to create holes and structures and walkways through the buildings. And again, to create those extraordinary ecological niches for the ferns, because in these mines, we find species of native ferns that grow naturally on the walls of the limestone quarries. But just to create an exciting environment that people can explore, and at the same time are connecting to the nature. And this is how it would look on the top, and you get fantastic views from the top. So this is another way that we're trying to integrate native plants, restoration ecology into a post-industrial landscape. So as I've taken you through some of the projects that we're engaged in, and some of the work that we're doing, and all the time I've been talking about how we need to create the relationships between people and the plants, people and the environment. And so that's really just some images of the work that we do, the groups that come to the gardens, and how we communicate this extraordinary diversity of nature, so that people can enjoy it. And when they have a good relationship with nature, maybe they can work with the environment. This is another aspect of the work that we've done. We've created a website, Plant Key, which works with QR codes. So we now label the plants in some of the areas, which allows people to use their smartphones to go and discover more about the plants. It's about introducing people to the plants, creating that relationship by giving them names, by giving the local name, the common names, the botanical names, finding more information out about the plants easily and accessibly. It helps people to get to know the plants. And so this is something that we have on all of our sites, that the plants are connected, and people can easily find out information about the plants. And that really brings me to the end of the talk. And this is somehow just a little point of to the landscape architects amongst you all that are listening, is that with ecological landscapes, with the native plants, we can create extraordinary landscapes which don't use the high water usage, that are definitely attracting the birds and the butterflies. So we have a dynamic landscape. The landscape is deeper in the sense that it's not just the flowers, it's not just the wow factor of walking in and seeing the heliconias or something like that, but you're really having a connection to the local forest. And the local forest is really an expression of the local environment, the weather, the soil, the history of the place, the connection to geological time. And so to relate to those plants is really connecting us back to the core spirit of where we as humans have emerged from. And it can also be a signal of the commitment to green aspirations. We are working with, at the moment, we're working with a number of companies. Ramco is one of them. And they really, as a company, have made that commitment, that signal to the environment, that they want to restore the areas that they have worked upon. And one thing in particular that we realized in the Pandalguri mines is that having it started as a flat piece of monolysis land that was maybe 800 meters or 1 kilometer wide, but once the mining process has gone on, we actually have an extraordinary landscape with ecological niches that is far more diverse than the initial landscape. So in some ways, the outcome of the mining operation has created the potential to create an extremely interestingly diverse natural native habitat, which gives us this concentrated aspect of rewilding. And by taking on those large areas of 800 acres, we start to be able to create ecosystems that have a very strong connection to the native flora and fauna in areas where all around there's simply precipice and agricultural development. So that, in a nutshell, is how I'd like to end my talk. It's 8 o'clock almost, so I hopefully haven't gone on too long. And thank you very much if you're listening.
Yep. Thank you so much. It was a quite enlightening talk and quite informative. So I would open, with your permission, open the house for question and answers. People can start putting in their questions in the message box here, and then I'll read out the names one by one, so they can ask their questions. So while there are questions that are flooding in, I myself have a question. Can you it's more about asking you, like, if you can just explain a little more about, did you do soil amendments when you did these restorations in such projects where they were already there was a damage that had happened?
With the mining, with the old mines, we're basically working with rock, but so we're working with a fragmented granite, which has some sand and some minor nutrients available. But there, what we've been able to do is that before the mining operations began, the whole area was cleared of the topsoil. So we found a few kilometers down the road a mountain of soil that they'd actually removed and never thought to use again. And so when we saw that pile of topsoil, we immediately started to think how we could use that. And so basically what we've done is we've dug pits on the rock and filled it with the original topsoil. And then we have also used vermicompost, because it's a very good way of establishing plants in those sort of landscapes. But the growth rates that we're seeing there is really down to the looseness of the soil. Compaction of soil really does slow down a plant's growth. That's what we've really clearly noticed in these mine restoration projects, where the soil has been recently excavated or moved and the soil is loose. Once we put some nutrients, the root growth must be extraordinary into the loose soil, and we get these quite stunning growth rates. If you see the pictures of how it looks today, the trees are already over 2.5 meters tall in a lot of the places. So the growth rates on the loose soil. So I think a lot of slow growth in these situations can be down to compaction of soil, because it's the roots that really need to move.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take another question from Soma. Soma, if you can ask your question, please. You'll have to unmute yourself. Please try doing it now. Okay, I can read out the question for Soma. It's what is the role of local forest and horticulture department in this project?
In the projects that we've worked here, we're working with the Ramco horticultural departments. So we have a very close partnership with Ramco. They have connections to the forest department. And so in the past, they have been bringing in seedlings from the forest department nurseries. The range of seedlings within the forest department nurseries are quite limited. They tend to grow what we can call easy trees. They grow things like Pongamia, Terminalia arjuna, Dilonis regia, Cassia Cymea, a little bit of, sometimes you can get a little bit of Ficus benegalensis, Ficus librigiosa, Peltophorum, they'll grow. So that was the original palette of the team, the horticultural team from Ramco. And by working with us, what we're doing is introducing a whole new set of species that simply people have never noticed. So the relationship is there. And I think what we're trying to do with the local horticultural teams and also with the local nurseries is by showing them which species are adapted for these areas, to create a demand for those species, and hence people then start to look at growing those species again. There's a tree, Acacia leucofloea, Acacia chundra, which are both trees that perhaps were planted in the 60s by the forest department, but had gone out of favor. But by including those in a biodiversity rich plantation, I think in the 60s they were planted as monocultures, but re-establishing those in biodiversity plantations, where you're planting 80 different species and at quite equal percentages, there's a role for all these local native thorny species. Every species somehow has a role, and the idea really behind our plantations is to set all of those species into the landscape, and by the second generation, as the regeneration happens through animal transfer of seeds or wind dispersal of seeds, that each plant is finding its own niche. And so this is definitely what's happened in Oroville, is that we've planted many species, and now as you walk through the forests of Oroville, we're finding these clusters of different evergreens that have been moved by the bats, or moved by the porcupines, or transferred by the jackals. So all of these processes, which once we've started the plantation, as the time goes by, these processes kickstart themselves, and they develop into the rewilded forest or the natural ecosystem. I think that's the way I look at what we're doing. And we really are just trying to liaise and create demand with the forest department, with the local horticulturalist, so that their interest, they suddenly go, oh yes, we knew about that species, but we never thought to use it. So that's somehow the relationship we have with them, and that's their involvement.
Okay, thank you so much. I believe that answers your question. I think the next question is from Faisal. If you can just
if Paul
Sure.
if Paul
possible.
can if Paul can just put his video on, then Paul can we'll see you, Paul, when you answer.
Oh, okay, sorry. What do I? Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Is that better? Yes. Sorry.
Yeah,
Apologies.
this is better.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
I wanted to ask Paul.
Yeah.
You didn't show us or speak much about grasses. Any particular reason?
Our speciality is not with grasses. When Vasant works in the hills around Uti, he works a lot with grasses. When we work with grasses, we've discovered a lot in these mines that there's local native grasses. Again, when you reduce the grazing pressure from the goats, particularly when you're trying to stabilize the sides of the quarries, there's an extraordinary array of native grasses that are coming in. And the root systems of those plants are really the first stage in stabilizing the soils. But we our work is really where we're planting trees, and so it's perhaps something that we need to look at more in the future. But I think we're keen to get forest established, shade on the ground. When we do use grasses, if we do create lawns, we use native grasses. We've done a number of resorts, and we don't use carpet grass, and we don't use any kind of commercial grass. We simply go to the local fields and use the Cynodon dactylin, which is growing locally, and you create, again, beautiful. You can create grassy areas which basically have very little maintenance, because those grasses are adapted to the local conditions. But it's something that at one point I did study a lot of grasses of the local area, but we haven't used them in our restoration work.
Thanks.
Okay, may I request Bhagyashree to ask you a question, please?
Hello, this is Bhagyashree. Thank you, Paul, for a wonderful insight of your projects. My question for the first project about the wetland for the, I believe it was a chemical factory.
It was
Uh,
at Ashok Leyland, which is a motor company.
oh, okay. So was there any repercussion of, was the factory functional? And if not, previously, were there any chemicals or any specific condition that was there which wetlands have treated to restore the uh, or rejuvenate the soil or anything?
It was actually a research and development center. So they have 150 acres where they have a number of labs, engine workshops, a testing track, and it's still a functioning research and development center. And they had that, and they had this corner of the land where they decided they wanted to do something ecological. So there was no, as it were, chemical pollution of the soil itself. The only challenge we faced there in terms of the soil was the salinity, because the groundwater in that area is quite saline. Like I said, it's 2,200 as a sort of a TDS, and we found that, again, this was a learning process for us by using the species that are connected to mangroves, like the mangroves associate, like for example Salvadora persica. These species have quite a high tolerance to the saline content in the water. We'd also done a resort close to a wetlands, and we'd had the experience where that area had flooded during the rains in 2014, and we discovered a number of species that could tolerate flooding, can tolerate these saline conditions. For example, there's a wonderful creeper called Salacia chinensis, which spent 2 weeks underwater, and the day the water went down and it could see the sun again, it put on new leaf. So there are interesting plants that are adapted to local conditions, that if we take them and use them in our projects, they have this extraordinary resilience and help us to reestablish a kind of a native ecosystem. But in order to answer the question precisely, that there was no real chemical pollution in that wetland.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So one question that comes to mind related to this is, if there is a land that is, degraded with these pollutants and leaching happens, then do you start with trees, or you think it's a better idea to first replenish the soil with the way we have the groundwater recharge and other stuff, or we first do the planting aspect of it?
I personally, I love trees, and I think trees are probably in a lot of circumstances are wonderful ways to restore the environment and to create wilderness or wildness. But there are, of course, other ecological niches, like the grasslands high above the, in the hills, which are naturally grasslands, and they have also a hugely important ecological role to play, and the restoration of those wildlands is as important, if not more important, than planting forests. When we have degraded areas, I think it's really like we're doing a lot of work now, sort of taking these dense plantations where we're planting in large numbers of shrubs and trees, really large numbers of species, because I think by creating diverse plantations, you see what works. You use your ecological intelligence, the knowledge that some species are saline tolerant, some species are drought tolerant, they can deal with those environmental conditions. But when we're dealing with degraded sites, you can have extraordinary results just by seeing what nature can do. So a diversity of plantation, if you plant grasses and you plant trees and you plant shrubs, and we also plant creepers. We use Deris scandens, which is strongly nitrogen fixing. We use Combretum ovalifolia, which is an extraordinarily strong liana, but again, that seems to thrive on these loose soils and put its roots in and start to stabilize. So these areas that are disturbed by human activity, be it mining or be it pollution or be it agriculture, I think it's about using ecological knowledge that we have, and then putting the question out to nature as to what works best, and seeing which way it goes forward.
Okay, thank you. That's more informative. I would request, before I go to Ruth's question, Ruth, these talks, I just wanted to let know everyone that these talks are available on Isola website, and we're trying to assemble them together, and then we'll all circulate a link again. But these talks will be uploaded on Isola website later. So may I request Ruth to ask his question, please? I believe his mic is not working. I'll ask the question on behalf of Rudra. The question is, can you elaborate the process you undertook to identify native species and what niches they occupy?
The way we went about identifying the local species was to basically go to temple groves and to the reserve forests and walk and photograph and collect and identify. And we slowly built up a species list. For the tropical dry evergreen forest, we came up with over 1,000 species when we had included the grasses and the herbs. And so it's really about exploring. I mean, as a young child or as a young man, I love to walk in the forest. I love to explore. And so this work that we did in the 1990s really was exploration. It was poking around. It was stopping the bike or stopping the car or going off on the bicycle and seeing what we found along the hedgerows and just identifying. The way we identified, the easiest way we found was in a group. There were 3 or 4 of us, and shared knowledge, shared intelligence in those days was really the way forward, no? Because someone would remember something or someone would remember something else. Now, I think there's a lot of websites out there that really can help people to identify the plants. In terms of ecological niches, I think it's back to experience by going out and seeing where the plants grow, seeing the plants that grow in the shade. There's a whole collection of shrubs, evergreen shrubs that grow happily in the shade, like Polyarthia suberosa. Or so just by observation, just by going to the forest, going to the remnants, walking along the hedgerows, walking along tank bunds, that's where we sort of gathered that information, and slowly you collect it in databases or in Excel sheets or in notebooks, and eventually it sort of stays in your mind, and you start to get to know the species. So it's really that's the way we discovered the plants of the tropical dry evergreen forest. It was a great adventure. We had great fun doing it.
Okay, thank you. I believe Rudra, it's answered. Your question is answered. Any more questions?
There's something I want to say, Shwetal.
Yes, please.
You know, in my limited experience of landscape architecture schools, this is one of the problems that students are not taught ecology, and they're not taught about native plants. And as a result, I think it becomes the only recourse for architects, landscape architects, especially when they first start out, is to depend entirely on what nurseries can offer them. And what nurseries offer is a very small, limited, tired suite of plants that they determine are in demand. Many of them are exotics. Many of them are completely cosmopolitan. They're available in Chennai, they're available in Lucknow, they're available in the desert, they're available in the Northeast. So we really need to break this disjunction. And Paul, thank you so much for that talk, because you really brought home how important it is to understand a native flora and to relate that flora to conditions, to local conditions. And that's really what I want to be the big takeaway for all these talks for landscape architects in general. So thank you again.
Yeah, and I believe they, as rightly said, these native plants help much faster when it's considered with time, and if it's to restore anything or rewild anything. There's always a question of time, and if we do practice with native plants, the results are much faster and more sustained.
I'm not sure that that is necessarily true, Shaitan. I'm sure you can get quick results with some plants that are not necessarily native. But in terms of sustainability, which again is something that Paul has stressed again and again, you want plants to be able to live ultimately without intervention from you, without being watered, without being given nutrients. And that a native plant can do, because for millions of years it has evolved in those conditions to become perfectly adapted, you see. Whereas the minute you have a thirsty plant that needs water, at intervals, or needs to be fertilized, you've lost sustainability. And when you have large parcels of land that you're restoring, you can't possibly go around watering everything.
Right. So when I meant with the time factor, it was not about the trees alone, but the entire ecology. Because many times what we notice is you get a monoculture of plants, which is practiced when all of a sudden you are asked to that there are these 20,000 saplings, and you this is the land available and please plant it. So that is where I wanted to say that if there is a monoculture, or if there is one kind of species which is just planted because it grows fast, I think the reviving of ecology will not be that faster. Rather, it will. There's no other magnet for any other entity of the ecology to come and change the habitat or be there. So in that sense, I believe the native plants in a overall ecological aspect should be helping much faster.
I'm wondering, Paul, whether you'd like to talk about something that I find very interesting, and that is that when you're making aesthetic choices about what to plant, supposing you're doing a native plant garden in a small ornamental space, how do you decide? I mean, one way, of course, is to just use your instincts and not necessarily articulate them. But do you have some method by which you decide how to display them, or how to arrange them, or how to, situate them in relation to each other? Are you, for example, consciously imitating things you see in nature, or are you not? Are you completely unconcerned about that aspect?
No, I think in nature what we have is an extraordinarily clear, how to say, guide. When we find particular plants together, there's this wonderful moment. Like we go into the hills around, not so far away from us, in a place called Jinji. And there the collection of plants is so beautifully arranged. You can't, there's rocks and there's plants, and you can't believe that it's not planted because it looks so natural. So I think what we try and do is when we're doing smaller landscapes, we really try to pick the plants. We know that each plant has its own shade of leaf. Each plant has its own flowering season. When we're deciding the palette to plant, we try to have as much diversity of flowering times as possible, because that will definitely strengthen the ecological potential of the plantation. It also makes it a lot more interesting, for people to walk through, which in a situation like that is ultimately your goal, is to create a vibrant, dynamic landscape. I mean, I say that so many times, but if you have butterflies flying in your landscape is so much more interesting. If you have the birds that follow the insects. I mean, when we have our monsoon, there's a whole collection of birds that follow the insects. We have the forest wagtail, we have the pitta, we have the paradise flycatchers. We have all of those birds that come in, but they only come in if you have the habitat that the insects will like, because they scratch on the ground and or they catch them in the air. So I think what we're really doing is we're thinking in those terms, and then we also know the growth rates, because, for example, some of the natives are slow. The Memsilon umbellatum, fantastic plant, beautiful flowers, but it's slow. So we kind of sneak those ones in, that nobody, you won't necessarily notice them for the first 5 or 6 years, but suddenly after 7 years, you'll get these amazingly beautiful flowering colors. And so when we do that, we know that the Walsura is probably the fastest growing tree along with the Aglias. So we mix in like that. And so the planting patterns are very much based on the growth rates and the final habits, not to plant trees too close and to give the shrubs the spaces. So that's how we work, I think, when we're doing smaller spaces.
For all the landscape architects
I have a
who are
question.
attending this talk, sorry, can I just finish what I'm saying? I think it's important to understand what Paul is saying, which is that, if you imitate the ways in which plants arrange themselves in nature, that's very different. Lots of people have this instinct of wanting to create dense woodlands. For example, this is the underlying reflex of people who want to make Miyawaki forests, for example. They think that by having things growing 2 feet from each other and by having a dense wall of vegetation, you're creating something beautiful. There is a biodiversity park in Delhi where, trees from the dry thorn forest have been grown, but they've been grown so close to each other. You've got a dense forest where in nature you will never find it in the Aravalis, So I think it's very important to understand the spatial relations between plants in a native landscape when you're planting, and not just try and create artificially dense landscapes. Sorry, go ahead, Bhagishi, you with your question.
Thank you, sir. My question was, yeah, Paul has answered one of my questions as how do you start with a planting plan, maybe. But this was what I wanted to ask is, when you have such huge lands, do you do some kind of zoning, or do you decide which area to start with first? Something like that.
Yes, zoning is exactly what we do, and that's when I was talking about using the GPS. It's important to walk the land. We've done projects in the past where we've been with landowners who've never got out of the car almost. They get out of the car, look at the land, and say, "This is my land." That was in the old. That was a while back. No, but it was definitely a phenomena, and I think that, like, our strength is just we love to walk on the land. And by walking on the land, you read the landscape. I mean, there's probably been books written about reading the landscape, and you can go on classes, but reading the landscape to me is just walking and observing. Like Pradeep has said, no, if you observe that there's areas that are open with grasses, then that's how efficient nature would be. So when we zone land, we do it. We plant different zones first. It can be technical. It can be the fact that it's easier to get the plants into the first zone. In the mining projects, we planted the flatlands before we planted the slopes, because the slopes took a while to stabilize. But definitely zoning your landscape, understanding the different ecologies. And if you have the luxury of time, I think sometimes you don't have the luxury of time because the client says, let's do this, or let's finish this now. But if you do have the luxury of time, then you get to choose your seedlings, because different plants grow differently in different ecological niches, and you don't necessarily have all your plants the same year in the nursery. I talked about this thing of recruitment to the forest, and that's very true even in our plant nurseries. Some years we have ebony in the nursery because it seeds, but it only seeds every 2 or 3 years. So some years there's no ebony in the nursery. So by zoning, by taking time, you actually can do a much more interesting plantation. And if if that's possible, then that's how it should be done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Abhinayana has a question next. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, I would like to know from you about the secondary benefits of the rewilding projects that you've worked on, such as groundwater tables being recharged or wildlife returning to these places, or anything else that you may have noticed.
The wildlife returning is extraordinary. I mean, the stories from Oroville itself are fantastic. No, the wasteland, the forests came back, and then the species returning, and we, like the porcupines came, but where did they come from? No, we knew that they were 60 kilometers away, and then they found their way back. In Oroville now we have deer populations that are returning. So I think, there's always the stages. The butterflies and the birds are first, simply because they travel quicker. But the habitat that returns, and one of the things that really, it's not necessarily wildlife, but one of the things I really enjoy, because it's one of my passions, is the fungus, the mushrooms and the toadstools, and that's something that I will spend a lot more time with as the years go by, because in Oroville the mushrooms are returning, and we see it each year as new ones start to fruit. And we know that the mycelial connections of the trees can be there for many years before the fruiting bodies come up of the mushrooms. And so this is something that we're very interested in the mining areas, because there we're working with really, harsh conditions. And this year we went looking to see if there were any mushrooms that were coming, and nothing had come yet. But from the books I've read recently, and this is such an important part of the ecology of the forests, the connections between the trees of the mycelium. So this is a very, very interesting aspect of rewilding, because it really is the connectivity of the plants, the sharing of resources. In the mines, we have started to experience it. We've been working there intensely for the last 18 months, 2 years. But we do have populations of birds returning, and the nice thing is the nests. When you start to see the nests of the birds, and it's another thing. Pradeep had mentioned thorny species, and I think it's very important to mention thorny species when we're talking about rewilding, because so many of the birds love to nest in the thorny species. They're protected there from the crows and from the other predatory corvids. So thorns are not necessarily happily included in landscapes, because people don't feel that they're beautiful. But over the years, I've really come to appreciate those little thorny corners that the birds can really find places to create their nests. We have a joy when the tailor birds come back, and that's happening in the mines. We've also, when water is a key to the wildlife. So where we create these water bodies, or where we create access to the water, there we're also seeing animals coming back. We've actually seen in the mines deer have returned in the quieter areas, and the porcupines will also come, I'm sure. So monitor lizards, porcupines, jackals, all of these animals are returning to the areas that we've worked upon.
Thank you. And also about the groundwater recharging, the groundwater tables, have they improved in the surrounding communities and villages, or anything like that? That you know of?
In the mining areas, we haven't seen that. There they have a very what to say? They have a very dry land agriculture. There's not much relationship to groundwater, and the TDS of the groundwater in that area is extremely high due to the limestone. It's not due to any other reason. Like, it's a naturally high TDS, so people don't actually work that much with the groundwater. They work generally with columns. They catch the rains. In the Ashok Leyland project, we're working on areas where the groundwater anyway comes up to ground level, because it's close to the sea and there's a high groundwater. The experience in Oroville was that initially, when Oroville started planting trees, the groundwater level dropped. And there was always a large debate as to whether it was the trees that were removing the water, or whether it was the development around where people were getting bore wells and extracting the water. So there's for me, it's still a debate. I think in certain areas where the streams flow, we can see that the forest in terms of the through flow, so when you're talking about through flow, which is keeping the streams running, this is always enhanced by the existence of natural grassland or natural forests. And so when we're restoring those areas, like when we were working in Uti on the project up there, we started to feel, I mean, we didn't do it scientifically, but we started to feel that the streams were running for longer because of the plantations of the shola forests and the grassland. So it's anecdotal, the information that we have, rather than scientific. And I think if you want to really see changes in groundwater, it's important to it's on a very large scale, and you've got to take into account the surrounding land use, because people are extracting huge amounts of water these days with bore wells and current pumps in Tamil Nadu, for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Any more questions?
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Paul, in Rajasthan, which I've been exploring for some years, we found at least 2, if not 3 species of clonal trees that prefer to grow as with common roots. Have you found that at all in the TDF or in the dry areas where you've been working?
In the dry areas, for sure. Balanitis, this Balanitis.
Yeah, Balanitis is clonal. That's right.
It's totally, once it's established, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's just the runners just go. Yeah,
the runners go everywhere.
We have Balanitis here on the ridge in Delhi, actually, quite a lot.
It's fantastic. I love that. It took me a while to identify it, but when I identified it, I was very happy. We have Garcinia spicata, which is, you've got the Garcinia indica, which grows in Maharashtra, the kokam. It's also the mangosteen. So we have Garcinia spicata, which is a coastal species, and that's definitely clonal. As you walk around the base of the tree, there's a lot of shoots that are coming up. The caparices, the shrubs, Caparis brevispina, they're definitely, particularly you find them on the canyon walls, no? And then once the canyons degrade, then they keep, again, they stay there for a long time. A lot of the trees, though, the Diospyros urbanum, the Walsura trifoliata, they're not really suckering. They're not suckering trees. They coppice. The Mempsilon is often you find it in our places as very small shrubs. But if you let it grow after 100 years, you get reasonably sized small trees, no? But a lot of the trees I wouldn't say are clonal in that sense in the tropical dry evergreen forest.
We get on the ridge here in Delhi, we get Caparis sepiaria, which you also get in the TDF. And I wondered once whether it had been introduced from the south to Delhi, because it's very unusual to find an evergreen species on the ridge here.
Okay.
But I do believe it's native, and you find it all along the Aravallis, actually. So it's one of those anomalous species that
right.
And it plays a terrific role, because it actually provides, it makes the forest opaque. If it wasn't there, you would see through it in the dry season. But because the Caparis sepiaria is there, it actually forms a barrier, to a visual barrier.
Yeah. But you have Atlantia monophylla and things like that now on the ridge?
No Atlantia, no Atlantia at all.
Oh, okay. That's another amazing tree.
Yes,
I have a question. In Tamil Nadu, where else you find a Balanitis?
I don't know. I think it's only down in the south. That's not true, because we've just started this project in Arialo on the limestones, and we found Balanitis there. So I have a wonder if it's not connected to limestone.
I'm sure you'll find it in Anantapura as well, in Andhra Pradesh.
I haven't explored that area. We just started working in Kunnur, but I haven't been
Yeah.
there. Again, it's another project site.
I don't remember seeing it in other places in Tamil Nadu in dry habitat.
Yeah.
It is.
But like I say, in Ariolo, which is quite high rainfall, it's growing there next to the limestone mines. So it might have some connection to that sort of soil. I'm not sure. It's
It
You know,
something-
doesn't-
even east of Mudungmala and all, the junction between Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats.
Mm.
I don't remember seeing balanitis, which
No,
is
it's
very
not
common
common.
in Sariska and so on. Yeah.
Mm.
Have you
Balanitis.
noticed, Dr. Johnson, have you noticed how much the fruit are eaten by jackals and nilgai?
Nilgai, they regurgitate the seed also.
Yes, yeah.
If you walk in Sariska, you'll find the bunches of balanitis seeds.
But
And it's
on
an
the
African species, I mean, our Alan Rogers, when he was, when he got appointed to Wildlife Institute first time when we went to Sariska, he was so happy to see balanitis. He said, that, it reminds me of East Africa.
the African species is a different species of balanite. It's not Roxburghia, it's something else. But the
Egyptiaca, we used to identify it as balanitis Egyptiaca.
yeah, that's a
What we see
different
in
species.
Sariska.
So what on the ridge we don't have nilgai, but you find the fruit having been eaten. Basically, the outside is stripped, so that just the inside is left. And this is the job of either of jackals or of civets. I'm not sure which one.
The other interesting thing about balanitis is when we grow it in the nursery, if you bury the seed, it dies. If you put it just on the surface, then you get good germination and good survival. So we made the mistake in the beginning of burying the seed, and so that
you told me about jackal. Was it jackal or Indian fox that in that Ramco area?
Jackal. Jackals are there. Jackals are there.
No Indian fox?
I'm sure there will be, but I haven't spent enough time at night, and they're very solitary, the Indian fox. So
No, but it will be more in the very flat area. Will not come with the rocky.
Right.
But you said in Auroville that cheetal has come, spotted
The
deer.
jackal, the Indian fox is in jackal. The jackal, the Indian fox. Both of those animals are here, and
No,
jungle
but
cat.
in Auroville you have cheetal, spotted deer.
Yes, they just come just recently. We don't have big herds, but there's one or two individuals that are coming, and black buck as well.
Oh, black buck. Very interesting.
All right. Well, is that it? Is that in terms of questions? Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. That was just wonderful.
Thank you.
We're all going to come and visit you, every single one of us.
You're totally most welcome. You're absolutely. You're very, very welcome. We enjoy people.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending a weekday, and thank you for everyone joining here and looking at these interesting talks. I would request Pradeep sir, if you can just close the session by letting us a little more about the last talk that we have and the most interesting one, I believe.
Yes, just to remind you all that Suprabha session is going to be talking about the work that she and this wonderful community that lives in an organization called the Gurukula Sanctuary, Botanic